Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for the final day of the New in Chess Classic. Your mans is back after the second COVID vaccine. Side effects, I had a day, but today I'm back to normal. Just did 6 hours of commentary, and I'm here to make this recap. Let's do this thing. It's Magnus, Carlsen, and Hikaru Nakamura playing for the final match, but we've also got Shakh, and Levon who provided us a barn burner. I put timestamps on the video players for the games. Magnus is up 1-0, and Mamidyarov and Aranyan are tied 50-50, which means that the winner of the rapid portion wins the whole thing, but they might play Blitz and Armageddon. We're going to kick things off with this game. Levon begins with e4, e5, and we have a Rue Lopez. We have a6, bishop a4, and now black has a choice of what to play in this position and goes for knight f6. And here white plays d3. Now normally white castles here and plays for c3 and d4. But this is a more trendy line with d3. Now we have b5, bishop here, and bishop c5. This is actually b5 and bishop c5 against c3 and d4 is known as the Archangel, which sounds like a very cool name. But here black's entire idea is to kind of bait white into this pin and now drop the bishop back and sort of argue that this doesn't make any sense. This bishop needs to be on c1. It doesn't really need to be out here. And, well, this just leads to a very imbalanced position. We have pawn to a4, rook to b8, moving off the way of this pin, castles d6, knight d2, and castles by black. And here black begins active operations. So Shakh plays knight a5, attacking the bishop on b3. The bishop moves out of the way. Shakh takes some space. Rook e1, queen c7. That's the thing about the Rue Lopez. It's a giant maneuvering affair. Like 14 moves have been played by both players, and nothing's been traded. It's just a ton of maneuvering here. So we have b4, aggressive move, takes, knight comes back to c6, and the rook is pinned. And thus far, it's a very complex battle, you know? And here, you know, Shakhriyar, when left to do his own thing, is going to play moves like knight to h5. Very provocative move, trying to trade pieces and get his knight to f4, which is exactly the way he plays. That's why we love him. Knight to e3 played by Levon, looking for light squared real estate in the center of the board, and queen f6. The idea of queen f6 is preparing an f-file attack. And here, Levon, you know, he does what all super GMs do when they don't know what to do, which is play what? Let's play the move h4. Except in this case, I truly, legitimately, from the bottom of my heart, have no idea what he was trying to accomplish. And first, Shakh took this pawn with the idea to deflect the queen away from all of these squares. Levon did not take. He tried to kick the knight out, and then Shakh just waited bishop e6. Very nice move. Because after takes, he took with the f-pawn. He sacrificed his knight, and now we see the entire justification of his setup, and he picked up 2 more pawns, and then a 3rd pawn, and we have a position here where white has 2 pawns, and black has 7. 7 to 2. When's the last time you've seen a guy have 2 little pawns, and the other guy's got 7, and Levon's just in trouble. And the way Shakh converts this is he simplifies down and puts his knight in the middle. Queen b7, knight e2. Ultimately, he wins back the knight. Levon has to get into a subpar endgame where Levon picks up a couple of pawns along the way, but he's still 3 pawns down. Shakh can win this in a variety of ways. He can play rook f4, rook f3, trying to attack stuff, centralize the knight, win it slowly. But from here on out, Shakh predicts the next 17 moves of the game. I'm not even kidding. He plays rook f1, sacrificing the rook to fork and win this. At this point, he anticipates that he will move the pawn to a2, which is exactly what he does. The knight is now immobile. The only way that white is going to play here is to bring the king and win the a-pawn. So he proceeds to do that. Shakh at this point doesn't move any pawns. Instead, he runs the king this way, because he knows that white cannot make any progress except this. He then runs the king to f4, king takes a2, and now and only now does he play g5. And this is actually not hard for him to calculate because white can't move anything. White plays king b3, g4, king c4, g3. You've got to bring the knight back. Now I'm going to bring my king to get your knight out, and I'll just push. You have to sack your knight, king to d5, and pawn to a4. Pawn to a5. King takes pawn. If king comes back, then king comes back. There's nothing really here. You can go win my pawn, but I'll win both of your pawns. King d6, a4. Levon resigned. I'm not kidding when Shakh predicted that's the only reason you play rook f1, is because you see this entire force sequence all the way out into the end. When's the last time you calculated 17 moves in a row? When's the last time you calculated one move in a row? All right, be honest with yourself. Beautiful conversion from Shakh, who starts the match with a win. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to lie to you. Shakh proceeded to win the next game that he had black as well. They drew the second game, and he ended up winning 2.5-half, which meant that of 6 decisive games out of 7, all 6 were won with the black pieces in this match. I don't know the last time that's happened. Chess historians, statisticians, please feel free to try to find that. But congratulations to Mr. Mamedyarov, who wins the 3rd place. I'm going to expand this a little bit, and we'll adjust our scoreboard accordingly. Beautiful play from Shakh, who was a game away from making it to the finals, ultimately losing in an Armageddon format. So congratulations to Mamedyarov. Now we will move to the final match. The first game of the match between Hikaru and Magnus Carlsen. Hikaru plays the move d4. Magnus Carlsen responds with knight f6, e6, and now white has the choice to allow the Nimso or not allow the Nimso. Chooses to allow the Nimso and plays queen c2, one of the main lines. The other main line being e3, but here nowadays they're playing knight f3, f3, g3, etc. He plays queen c2. Magnus plays d5. We have a trade, and bishop comes out to g5, pinning the knight. Bishop comes back, and now black can play in a lot of ways, but Magnus gets confrontational. He plays c5. Idea being that once you take, it looks like I can just drop back and take, but rather than doing that, in many cases, black either plays g5 first, and knight to e4, or what Magnus does in this game, bishop to e6, just to stabilize the center. I promise they know what they're doing. Hikaru develops in the center, develops his knight d7, and Magnus wants to take with the knight, and then play g5 and knight e4. And here Hikaru plays a move that's been played one time ever in 50 games, knight to d4. Hikaru didn't do this by accident, because after bishop takes c5, he blitzed out the move bishop to d3. After this trade in the center, queen b6, he blitzed out the move queen d2, indirectly defending this pawn, because if you take, there is bishop h7 check, discovered check, and you lose the queen. Magnus played knight e4, looking to immediately punish and solve his problems, because white hasn't castled yet, so you attack the queen. The problem is that, ironically, now rather than playing this and saying, oh, I have 2 bishops, I'm so good at chess, you actually take with the bishop, and you go for a position where you have opposite-colored bishops, but you have a very well accounted for and defended d-pawn, all right? It's like sending the rich person off into a sus neighborhood, right? But that person's got, like, little intel surveillance on them. Maybe they're wearing a wire. I don't know if this is chess or some mafia movie, but pawn on d5 is well accounted for. Castles, Magnus rotates the queen. Hikaru plays pawn to d6, knight e5, and bishop to g3. Now, we have played 19 moves. At this point, Hikaru had more time on the clock than he started with. At the beginning of the game, you get 15 minutes. Every time you make a move, you get 10 seconds bonus. He had 16.5 minutes. He had prepared this. He knew what he was supposed to do here. He plays knight to b5. Tried to go to c7, and he does that. In fact, he plays knight to c7 in just a couple of moves. Improves the position of his queen as well. Magnus has to play rook f8. Now, Hikaru plays rook d1, centralizing his rook. At this point, Magnus doesn't have a lot of moves. Magnus is much worse. And there are 2 ways to play a worse position. Suffer and defend, create counterplay. Those are the 2 ways. So Magnus goes for counterplay, plays h5. Trying to play h4, bishop h3, etc. Hikaru doesn't try to play h3, h4, he plays queen c5. Pressure this way, pressure on a7. Magnus plays rook d7, blocking the pawn from moving up. Now here Hikaru could have played a very nice move. He could have played rook d5, which is actually what I thought his idea was during the time of the commentary. Rook d5 is a very nice move. Bishop g4, you play rook g5, h3, kick out the bishop. But Hikaru chose to attack with the pawns on the queen side with b4. And this allowed Magnus to strike pawn to e3, which on the surface looks just like he blundered a pawn, like he forgot pawns can take other pawns. But his idea was to do something called a clearance sacrifice, which is when you move a pawn forward to gain the square where that pawn used to stand. Now that bishop guards the knight, and the bishop pressures the king. And at this moment, Magnus could have justified this entire thing with the absolutely ridiculous computer line, pawn to b6, sacrificing everything on the queen side and creating queenside counterplay by ripping it all open. The computer is trying to argue that here somehow black is not just completely lost and has some chances, but Magnus Carlsen is not a computer, contrary to popular belief, and rather than sacrificing the entire house, he played the waiting move king to h7. And that move gave Hikaru the time to play b5 and bring the knight back. This knight rotation back to e7 is so important, because once Hikaru lands that knight e7 move, it slows down black in his tracks. Magnus at this point down to about 40 seconds on the clock because of all the time that he spent in the opening, plays the move queen g4, and all Hikaru had to do here was play bishop f4. That disconnects the queen from the protection of the bishop, and for example here, if you play a move like f5, you will lose the knight. If you take the bishop, I take and I fork you, and that's bad. And if anybody's confused why this is not checkmate, there's a rook protecting. And this would have been game over, probably. I mean, maybe bishop g6, and then somehow you will just kick out the queen. But Hikaru played bishop to e5, and that allowed Magnus one final trick, and that move is knight to g5. Baiting Hikaru into rook f4, knight h3 check, fork. But that's the best move, because after king to h1, black is lost. Knight takes f4 is met with check, and then you pick up the knight, and now you're just winning. I mean, black just can't defend this position against the passed pawn and everything. You just can't defend this position. Hikaru fell for that, and instead went back to f4, and here it's -5 for black because of the move heard around the world. Rook takes d6, seemingly taking the impossible pawn. Why? Because if rook takes d6, of course, you are just mated. But if bishop takes d6, knight h3, king h1, and since you made this possible by moving the bishop out of the way, bishop takes g2, rook g2, and queen to c4, and Magnus would have been completely winning. But he missed it. Instead of playing rook takes d6, he played this first. And now if you play rook takes d6, I take with check. You see what was missed? It's a move order thing, because he didn't have a lot of time. So now he just does this instead, and total pandemonium breaks loose. The position's still apparently like 0-0-0 according to the computer. Maybe you have a stronger one. Queen to e6. Takes, and here Magnus plays rook a8. Because if you take the queen, there's back rank mate. So Hikaru here plays king g1, rook a1, and brings this back. Rook goes back to d8. And the only winning move for white to stop this plan dead in its tracks, h3. Why? Because if the queen tries to come forward, this pawn is lost and the bishop is hanging. So Magnus went back to g5, but that allowed Hikaru the chance to push the pawn. Now you cannot move the rook because I promote. Queen e3, and now in beautiful style, check, only move, check, only move, back rank check, sacrificing the queen to make a new queen and mate. So the king has to go up, and now they're very simple, queen takes rook. And if you take me, I will deliver check here, check here, and I will win your queen via x-ray. So Magnus, instead of that, plays bishop takes g2, and Hikaru runs the king to safety and wins. Ladies and gentlemen, it is match on, because Hikaru Nakamura has struck first today. Beautiful preparation. That was one of the smoothest games that I think Hikaru played against Magnus, with the exception, of course, of this absolutely ludicrous rook takes d6. But that is the problem when you play Magnus Carlsen or Hikaru. It's never over. Trust me, I've played Hikaru many times. Every time you think you got one of these bastards in a corner, you're like, that's it, this is it. They come at you with some spinning triple backflip into a front flip, into an elbow, they just knock you out from the dumbest. It's crazy. I'm talking Alexei Oleinik with the Ezekiel choke when you full mount. My MMA folks, y'all understand what I'm talking about. Game number 2. Magnus Carlsen looking to strike back. He goes for e4, e5. And he goes for an Italian, gioco pianissimo, with c3, d3, nice and calm. And they had this game yesterday. All of these moves they had yesterday, including up until this moment. Yesterday, Magnus played a4. That was that 90-move queen endgame. Today, instead, he goes b4 and then b5. And his point is that this is just a free pawn. However, with the very calm move, knight back to f6, black says, homie, you took my pawn, but what about half of your pieces? And it's actually funny. This is kind of, I don't know. I don't know if this is a very Magnesian kind of game, because on the one hand, he's up a pawn, but on the other hand, none of his pieces are out. And Magnus is all about harmony. Like, he's all about, having the pieces out and, like, coordination. And I don't know if his style is very much taking a pawn and then kind of, like, proving your opponent's play incorrect. But it's very hard for him to develop here. So first he has to play knight d2 to defend his bishop from this pin. Now Hikaru plays bishop d6, kicking out the rook. And then he plays rook e8. It's amazing that this very simple offer of a rook exchange, which we'll see happens in just a move, trades off yet another one of white's only active pieces. And black just has this pressure. And then Magnus played bishop c2 to get his knight out of the way of the bishop. And Hikaru pounces with the move knight to d5. attacking the pawn on c3. And this move, knight to e4, defends that, except for the fact that it doesn't defend it at all. Here, Hikaru could have also played f5, which is another idea. Knight takes d6 and then taken, attacking the queen, and then taking back. And that leads to wild complications after, for example, queen here attacking the knight, knight e2 check, then you take, you can hang this, but etc, etc. There's a whole bunch of crazy lines. But Hikaru found a sequence of moves that forces a draw. Knight takes c3, knight takes c3, bishop takes f3, pawn takes f3, and I know you're going to say, well, I saw queen d2. The whole idea is that you cannot take here because of this, and if pawn takes f3, queen h3, f4, bishop c5, with the threat of check, because this is pinned. And this is just a draw. You say, how is it a draw? Knight e4 is the only move to protect against that threat, and black would sacrifice, and by this completely insane virtue of repetition, they would repeat. You cannot go here because of mate. And Hikaru saw that and said, hey, forced draw with black is good. I'm going to win the next game with white. Here we go. Let's go to the blitz. But Magnus played queen d2, and he's just worse here. Like, this is just not right because his structure is damaged. He's lacking in development, and black has no problems. But Hikaru chose to repeat moves anyway. Hikaru didn't have to do that. He could have, for example, played bishop back to h5, but he decided that he was going to draw this game and try to win the next game with white. Now, we will come to see whether or not that was the correct decision, but it's a big decision. It's a big decision to make. Ultimately, it's very easy to look at the computer evaluation and say, oh, it's -1. Well, we will come to see if it was the right decision. But that was a very interesting game. Knight c3, the whole chop, 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 chop. Again, first 2 games, Hikaru no problem. Seems to be in good shape. And now we go to game number 2. And game number 2... Sorry, 3, not game number 2. Game number 3. This time, Hikaru comes out with d4, but Magnus goes for a queen's gambit declined with the move a6. Okay? And a6 is designed to counterbalance this kind of pressure on the c-pawn, and then you want to play, counterbalance is the wrong word, but it's intended to pressure the c-pawn from a slightly different angle. But Hikaru just trades and gets this position. They trade dark squared bishops on d6, and now they just develop their pieces. Bishop g4, queen pops out to b3, attacks the b7 pawn. Magnus gambits it. If you take it, there's a chance you get your queen trapped, and then we trade on e2. So he trades on e2, castles, rook c1, and a few moves later, we got castles by Hikaru. This was an interesting moment as well, Hikaru offering a queen trade, voluntarily damaging his structure, but he's going to put rooks on b1 and c1, and that's kind of the point. Magnus chose not to do that. And instead we have this, and now pawn to g6. The idea of pawn to g6 is that you will go knight e6, knight g7, in many cases bringing the knight to f5, and maybe f5 in the future as well to counteract the bishop on d3. We have knight f4, rook e8 played by Magnus, bishop c2, c6, so far solid moves. And at this point, basically, the players have gotten to a position which looks completely in the balance. Now, what do you do from here? Hikaru's got to either win the game or draw it. He cannot lose. So what will he play? And after some thought, Hikaru decided that this was the game he was going to make his mark. So he played f4, which is a big decision. Massive structural weakness on the e4 square. But after knight to g7, he just plays f5. Idea being that after knight takes f5, you will go here, the queen will move, and then you will damage Magnus' structure irreparably. This is very, very bad for black. Then you will try to go for this pawn or bring your queen all the way around. It's the beauty of a queen. It can take 3 stops and get across the board, or sometimes do it in 1, but you can't teleport through pawns. Welcome to Gotham Chess Recaps. And for that reason, Magnus played g5. And Hikaru attacked the queen, and here played a move that we completely did not expect, and that move is pawn to h4, which is a pretty boss move. The idea of this move is that if Magnus were to take, now we will bring the queen back and immediately win that pawn, or just win it outright with rook f4, and just belligerently attack. But Magnus Carlsen is very tricky, and he played this move g4. That shuts down the play and allows the knight to activate via h5. So Hikaru played queen c3, knight h5, and here the computer gives a line e4, which is a crazy sacrificial idea intended to meet pawn takes e4 with the opening of the diagonal. That's obviously something I can generalize for all of you to understand, sacrificing a pawn with the intention of opening a certain diagonal, and f7 will be very, very nicely kind of pressured, or black plays knight takes e4, and then after this trade, you have this very nice move here. Try to find it for white. It's a very nice move. It looks like it doesn't do anything. White has only one move in this position that wins. Feel free to pause. That move is pawn to f6. And basically, you just lock black down. Like, black has no way back with the knight. Rook f5, rook g5, queen e3, queen g5 is on the way. It's amazing what one pawn move just completely kills black's position. Rook f5, trapping the knight, and then just going for the king. But it's Magnus Carlsen we're talking about. So I don't know if he would have allowed this. I'm sure that on e4 he would have taken with the pawn. But Hikaru chose queen e1. And now Magnus shrug. And he just sacrificed his rook. And this is a concept known as relative value. Rooks are not worth as much as knights. Rook is not worth as much as a knight and a pawn. But a rook for the knight and the pawn in this position leaves white with almost no active pieces. And black has 4. And the relative value of black's knights counterplaying against this bishop just cannot be understated. These rooks are not really participating in the game. And Magnus avoids a trade of queens and just slowly improves his position. He centralizes his queen. He then kicks out Hikaru's rook. He then brings in his knight, rook d1, and here Magnus played a move which was so egregious, I completely do not understand it. I don't understand it at all, and yet it's the top engine move, and it's king to f8. Again, some moves I just don't explain to you, because I don't know. Listen, I explain things to you that I understand, that I have taught to people in the past, that I can educate the beginners and intermediate players on. I never lie to you guys, okay? Except for when I tell you I'm a good chess player. King to f8. I don't know what the hell that move is. And yet it's the top engine move. It's the top engine move. And then Magnus brings the next knight to e4. And here, sometimes the best move in chess to go forward is to go back. Queen f6. And these knights make it impossible to protect h4. And even though Hikaru wins d5, h4 is taken. And the king's home is invaded. And it was in this position that Hikaru resigned. And that draws attention to two things. That draws attention to the repetition in the game prior, and it draws attention to, was playing aggressively in this position the right decision to make? Especially in a position that strategically is very much just balanced. To do this and push the pawns in front of the king and open things up, Hikaru said afterwards in the interview with me and Anna, when we did the live broadcast, that he actually had missed the move g4. He played h4 and he criticized himself very harshly, said g4 was just not a good move. H4 was not a good move in view of g4 arriving on the board. And he said that from there the game spiraled out of control. And here was his last chance to play e4, but Magnus Carlsen wins with the black pieces. That is a huge win. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Hikaru has to win. And Hikaru has to win with black. That's what he has to do. So, when you have to win with black, what do? You play the Sicilian defense. When you have to not lose with white and you are faced with the Sicilian defense, what do? You buy the Gotham Gambits repertoire at www.gotham-chess.com. Link is in the description. And you play the delayed wing gambit, right? But Magnus plays c3, the Alpin Sicilian, which is just very solid. Hikaru goes g6. We have a trade in the center with d5, and now Magnus plays e5. This is very standard stuff. Apologies, my allergies are bothering me. I'm going to have to rub my nose. And hopefully that's the last time I do it. Bishop g7, knight f3, and knight h6. This is actually very standard. Hikaru's not disrespecting Magnus by putting his knight on h6. Sometimes when I'm tilted in blitz, I'll play knight a6, knight b8 a few times. But this is not disrespect. If you go here, you lose the knight in one move. So knight h6, we have a check, block, castles, castles, h3. h3 is intended to prevent bishop g4. It's actually funny. These positions are really tough to play for intermediate players because they're not good at just structure. And especially when pawns don't defend other pawns. If this bishop comes here, and this knight comes here, d4 is lost. So Magnus needs to play this move. f6 and takes. And at this moment, Hikaru has a big decision to make. Since he's playing this game for a win, he probably should play rook f6. But that's a tough move to make, because Magnus can even do something as ugly as trade off both bishops for both knights, and just go here. And the truth is, this position's a nightmare to play for black. Like, it's just not easy to play this. You have no more moves. I rub my nose again. You just have no moves. Knight c3, f4, you just have no moves. Like, you need pawn play. So Hikaru goes for a symmetrical structure. And then he plays the move g5. So how do you deal with this? It's like dealing with a belligerent drunk guy at a bar. Sure, you could throw him out, but then the guy's gonna stand around in the street. Do you call the cops? Like, what do you do? I'm not speaking from experience. I've never thrown someone out of a bar or been thrown out of a bar myself, but you got a belligerent guy and he needs to take your head off, right? Queen d6, bishop a4, very nice trick. Threatening knight takes, queen takes, bishop b3. Hikaru moves out of the way and brings the knight back to e7. Queen e2 and knight back to g8. And from here on out, Hikaru needs to make this plan work. He has to create an attack against Magnus, and Magnus, meanwhile, plays queen b5. And the funny thing about queen b5 is he just wants a queen trade. Like, he just wants a queen trade. And now he plays bishop d2 to move his knight and then get this. So Hikaru plays b6 and a5, preventing that from happening, and also intending bishop to a6, which just basically traps the queen. So now Magnus has to slide out of the way of that, correctly doing so. Rook c8, rook c1, rook c6, intending to double. In a position of symmetrical structure, it's very tough. And when I mean symmetrical structure, I mean 3-3, 1-1, 2-2. Pawn structure is basically the same. And the players were shuffling here, and Hikaru had to trade a rook, but for the most part was just avoiding trades like the plague. I mean, it was like Magnus had COVID and Hikaru somehow knew about it, and he was just social distancing from his pieces. He was like, bro, I don't want any of that. Let's try to, try to create some sort of attack with h5, g4, f5, and so on, queen d1, knight to e7. But Magnus was sharp, man. And here Magnus came up with, again, the top computer line. This is just the annoying thing about playing Magnus Carlsen. Like, nobody except a super GM plays this plan here. This plan would never even begin to occur to me. Queen to b1. And obviously, when you look at that, you go, well, he's just doing this. Nah, man, you know what his idea was? His idea was to put the queen behind the b-pawn, to open up a new flank of attack and pressure from the queen side. And that's what he does. And obviously some expert player like some 2000s watch my videos. They're like, I would have played b4. Yeah, relax. Go take a long, hard look in the mirror. Maybe smack yourself. Knight c3, rook c7, knight e2. Magnus is just waiting. He's like, come on. Like, come on. Let's go. You got to play this for a win, but you're not equipped because you just don't have enough. And you're not going to beat me attacking me symmetrically. So now Hikaru plays h4 and Magnus chips away. He takes on e7, he gets rid of the bishop, and he picks up b6. Hikaru sacrifices the b-pawn with the intention of playing f5, g4, bishop h5, and Magnus says, okay, and? Bring the, I got the horses in the back. In the words of philosopher Lil Nas X, got the horses in the back. f5, bishop b5 kicks the queen out, queen mobilizes, knight drops back, Hikaru's ready. But the second Hikaru is ready, Magnus just says, who's guarding the g-pawn, my guy? And who's guarding this pawn? And who's guarding knight e5, knight f7? If you play g4, I'm coming in with my knight. I'm going to take this. I'm going to take that at some point. And yeah, on the surface, it looks like you can take, but you just traded your only active piece. Knight to f6, defending this. But now Magnus can employ a very simple plan. And that simple plan is me have pawn, me push pawn. Pawn to a4. And Hikaru doesn't have anything. If Hikaru plays g4, that just allows the knight to come forward. And that's why Magnus brought his knights back. If you actually notice a couple moves ago, he brought his knights back because no matter which pawn comes forward, the other knight will move up. So for example, if f4, this knight comes to g4, or knight to f3. If this pawn comes to g4, knight to f4. And that's the beautiful thing about knights. They can outmaneuver pawns anytime they move. And so after a4, Hikaru played a move. I mean, he just played a move, but the players agreed to a draw here, which is the sportsman-like way of when a player is playing someone and that someone needs to play for a win and they get over-aggressive, you just make the draw. It happens all the time at top-level events. And ultimately, they drew the match today. But on the overall score, it is Magnus winning the New in Chess Classic with the final score of 1.5 over Hikaru Nakamura in the rapid portion. So the players agreed to a draw. If at any moment two super GMs are in a situation where one needs to play for a win and that one just does something totally insane and plays really aggressively, like Hikaru did in this game, oftentimes they will make a draw. That's why, Magnus could play this position for a win, but more often than not, the players will just agree to a draw because it doesn't matter. Unless it's a rated game. But that aside, Magnus Carlsen is the winner, and that concludes our coverage of the New in Chess Classic. And Magnus tweeted after this and said something along the lines of, I just won my first tournament in a while, or I just won a chess tournament again. And that's because he hasn't won a chess tournament since he turned 30 years old. And that was November 30th, 2020. That's pretty rare. And now the interesting question becomes, how much of a confidence booster is this for Magnus moving forward as he prepares for the World Championship match. I know that sounds crazy. It's an online rapid tournament. There was a lot of players missing because of the candidates. But let's not forget, in 2020, we didn't see these guys playing over the board chess. And in November, we have Magnus versus Nepo for the finals, right? The World Championship match. So how much are we going to see Magnus playing in these events? How much are we going to see Nepo playing in these events? Fabiano Caruana didn't play the entire last year, basically, of online chess, and he didn't win the candidates. So is it to their benefit or not? I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And as always, it's an honor, it's a pleasure to make these recaps for you. Thank you so much for your continued support. And probably an hour after I post this, we will cross 900,000 subscribers, which is absolutely incredible because I started making YouTube videos 11 months ago. So subscribe if you haven't already, because we've got just 100K more and we're going to be at 1 million. And maybe within a few months, we'll be the biggest channel on YouTube. So I love you all, and I'll see you soon.